We live in a world where the truth often hides in the shadows, and some stories slip beyond logic, beyond fear, and into the realm of the unimaginable. Tonight, we dive into real cases, twisted mysteries, chilling confessions, and crimes so bizarre they haunt investigators to this day. From quiet neighborhoods masking unspeakable horrors, to killers who vanish without a trace, to victims whose ghosts still whisper through the evidence. These are the tales that defy reason, where every clue only raises more questions, and the truth is darker than anyone feared. Sylvia Cachay was born in Arlington, Virginia, to parents Antonio and Sylvia. Antonio was an otolaryngologist and a surgeon, and Sylvia was a painter. The Cachay family were very well off, and Sylvia had a very comfortable upbringing. But she also moved around a ton. She grew up in Virginia, as well as Lima, McLean, and Peru. Growing up, Sylvia was a die-hard lover of fashion. She had dreams of becoming a household name in the world of fashion. She was defined by her friends and family as very generous, trusting, and loyal. And she loved dogs and had 2 toy poodles. By her teen years, Sylvia attended private schools in Washington, D.C., but she was also very smart and driven. So after high school, Sylvia enrolled in Marymount College, and she graduated with a degree in fashion design. She did a ton of internships at various places, including Marc Jacobs. And later on, Sylvia also worked with prominent names in the fashion industry, like Tommy Hilfiger and Victoria's Secret. It was at Victoria's Secret where she became the head of the swimwear design, and that was when she had another vision in her mind. Sylvia wanted to have her own swimsuit brand. So Sylvia worked on establishing her business behind the scenes while still working at Victoria's Secret. And in 2006, she left and built her own little fashion empire of high-class swimsuits. Sylvia named her brand Sila after her mom, and she was very successful. Her swimsuits were featured in Sports Illustrated, as well as fashion magazines like Elle, InStyle, and Vogue. So it's safe to say that Sylvia was a big deal, and her brand, her brainchild, was slowly becoming a prominent name in the vast industry. Sylvia couldn't be more proud of herself. She dreamt of this since she was a child, and when she saw her work on the runway and in magazines, she knew that she had made it. So Sylvia's life was going pretty well. She did crave companionship, though. She wanted to find a person that she could talk to about everything and share her life with. Well, life had someone in store for her, and she crossed paths with a man named Nicholas Brooks in 2010. The two had a very interesting initial meeting, though. See, one of Sylvia's dogs had been hit by a car and had to be taken to a vet. And while all this was going on, the two met, and in a shocking turn of events, began a relationship almost immediately after. By all means, things were going very well for the two. But good things don't always last forever. Nicholas Brooks was actually the son of Academy Award-winning composer Joseph Brooks. He was known for writing, composing, producing, and scoring different commercial jingles, and one of his most renowned ones was You Light Up My Life, for which he won many accolades. But the same couldn't be said about his son. Nicholas led a very lavish lifestyle, but did nothing to contribute. Nicholas was basically living off his dad's money, and he was defined as a playboy and hopeless when it came to holding a job. He was unemployed most of the time, and to make matters worse, he was heavily dependent on illegal substances. Sylvia's friends defined her relationship with Nicholas to be on and off at best. They would constantly fight, make up, and repeat. Their relationship was extremely volatile, and Sylvia knew that she didn't want to spend her life with him. Also, it didn't help that Nicholas would cheat on Sylvia from time to time, and if that wasn't bad enough, he would use Sylvia's money and credit cards without her knowledge to take his mistresses out on dates. This was a whole different level of betrayal. He also used Sylvia's money to hire adult workers and pay for their services. I mean, cheating on your partner is one thing, but disrespecting them to this extent was a new low. Sylvia didn't know about any of this at first, but it was only a matter of time before she caught on. A day before the events of this case, Sylvia actually sent a very angry email to Nicholas. It entailed that she knew all about his rendezvous and how he spent her money, and that she was fed up with his antics. In the end, Sylvia bid Nicholas farewell and told him to have fun in jail. Based on the email, it's assumed that Sylvia was financially supporting Nicholas during their relationship, and Nicholas really went from leeching off his dad's trust fund to living off his girlfriend's money. and he still had the audacity to cheat on her. I literally have no words for this man. So you can tell that the relationship wasn't meant to last very long. But for some reason, a day after this email was sent, Sylvie and Nicholas met up and went to Soho House in Manhattan on December 9th of 2010. The couple checked in at about 12:30 a.m., and according to the desk clerk, Sylvie looked tired. Sylvie actually told the desk clerk that her boyfriend Nicholas was high on drugs and had set the bed on fire by tipping over some candles. They managed to put the fire out, but now they didn't want to sleep in that same room because it was filled with smoke and smelled bad. The desk clerk also told the police that Sylvie confessed that she'd taken a Xanax and could barely even keep her eyes open. Basically, she was exhausted. Well, the desk clerk immediately called the concierge, and no sooner than the two walked away from Sylvie's room, they heard a very heated argument start up. Shouting, berating, screaming, all of it. So the night was off to a great start. At around 12:45 a.m., a busboy brought a bucket of ice to their room, room 20. Surprisingly, he was met by Nicholas in the hallway, and the two went inside the room together. The busboy claimed he didn't see or hear anyone else in the room. About 2 hours later, at 2:11 a.m., CCTV cameras in the hallway caught Nicholas entering and exiting the room multiple times. He was seen walking up and down the hallway and then going back into the room. Around the same time Nicholas was in the room, a complaint was made by the room below Nicholas and Sylvie's about a water leak. The hotel management didn't check in on the leak right away, and a few minutes later at 2:18 a.m., Nicholas was seen walking out of the room, and he met up with a member of the hotel, David Raleigh, and the two went out for drinks. About 30 minutes later, at 2:51 a.m., another complaint was made about that same water leak, and this was when the hotel management finally got up and made their way to room 20 to check things out. Well, the management went to that room above, but no one answered. Realizing that the leak was at risk of becoming serious, they decided to enter the room anyway. And that's when they were met with a grisly scene. Hotel management went into room 20, and at first, everything seemed quiet. But then they heard something. It sounded like water running, and it was coming from the bathroom. As the management made their way inside, they saw something they could not unsee. A young woman was lying motionless and submerged in the hotel bathtub, and the water was overflowing from the running faucet. This was the water that had seeped down to the room below, causing the water leak. That woman was unfortunately 33-year-old Sylvia Cachay. She was found wearing a turtleneck sweater, pink underwear, and a Rolex watch, but nothing else. When management checked on her more closely, they realized she was gone. The hotel management called the police and emergency services, and Sylvie was pronounced deceased at 3:33 a.m. The desk clerk and concierge were honestly left speechless when they heard of Sylvie's body being discovered in the room. They literally saw her just a couple hours ago, and aside from being tired and irritated at her boyfriend, she was alive and well. But now, she wasn't. The police, while examining Sylvie's body, discovered marks on her neck, as well as what looked like a bite mark on her hand. The investigators were left scratching their heads because they didn't have any idea who could have done this to Sylvie. An autopsy was also carried out on Sylvie's body, and it was concluded that her death was a homicide, and that someone had held her underwater until she stopped breathing. That was until they asked around and found out that Sylvie had checked in with her boyfriend, Nicholas Brooks, who was currently having the time of his life downing drink after drink, not knowing that his girlfriend was just found lifeless in their hotel room. The police decided to wait for Nicholas to show up, and he eventually did. When he saw the crime scene tape and the abundance of officers at the door, he was slightly taken aback. When the police asked Nicholas where he had been, he told the police that he ran into someone that he knew and the two had gotten drinks. He didn't know anything about what had happened to Sylvie, and stressed that someone might have done this to her while he was out. But the police did not buy his story. Nicholas was literally the only one, aside from Sylvie, who had access to their hotel room. And after reviewing CCTV footage and going over Nicholas's history with Sylvie and their volatile relationship, as well as the email, they knew that Nicholas was behind Sylvie's passing. Also, Nicholas's DNA was found in the hotel room, the bathtub, as well as on the faucet, which was running at full speed when Sylvie was found. So it was pretty much a shut and done case from that point on. But Nicholas denied everything. But if Nicholas didn't do this, then who did? December 9th, literally on the same day Sylvie was murdered in the bathtub by hotel management, Nicholas Brooks was arrested by the police and charged with her murder. He pleaded not guilty to the second-degree murder charges, and he was awaiting trial. That trial was held shortly after in 2013, and a lot of Sylvie's friends testified against Nicholas. They told the jury all about the relationship problems between Sylvie and Nicholas, and how he was basically using Sylvie's money to take women out on dates and hire adult workers. Some of Sylvie's friends even testified that Sylvie didn't want to be with Nicholas anymore, saying that she couldn't see herself spending her entire life with a guy like him. Even though we don't know what the real motive behind such a crime of drastic proportions was, it's believed that when Sylvie threatened Nicholas via email that she would take him to the police for using her money like that, Nicholas was furious. He didn't want Sylvie to take such crazy measures, so he could only think of one thing: murdering her. We don't know if he planned this or if the idea just came to him on the spot, but the fact that Sylvie and Nicholas did spend the night together at their apartment is unsettling. Perhaps Nicholas tried to persuade Sylvie to forgive him and give him another chance. Maybe that was why, even after the angry email from Sylvie, she was with him at their apartment when their bed caught fire. But speaking of the bed, it was reported that the bed strangely caught fire while Sylvie was sleeping in it, and Nicholas was taking a shower in the midst of being in a drug-induced haze. The situation would have turned dire if Sylvie hadn't woken up when she did. Now, I might be reading too much into this, but that fire sounds like it may have been intentional. Well, it ultimately doesn't matter because in the end, Nicholas Brooks was found guilty of second-degree murder, and he was given the maximum sentence for this charge, which was 25 years. He'll be eligible for parole in 2038, and as of March of 2018, he's exhausted all of his conviction appeals. But this isn't the whole story, and things actually get much worse from here. It turns out, a year before Sylvie's murder, someone else was arrested for over 100 counts of sexual misconduct, including sexual assault. Over 100 individual counts. And that person was none other than Nicholas's father, Academy Award-winning composer Joseph Brooks. 71-year-old Joseph was arrested in June of 2009 for taking advantage of more than 10 women. And what's even more infuriating is that his assistant was helping him with these disgusting acts. See, Joseph was famous. He had money and he had influence. So he would use his assistant to help lure young and impressionable girls with bigger dreams of making it to Hollywood, under the pretense of discussing roles and auditions for movies. And Joseph would defile them in his East Side apartment. But how did Joseph get his hands on these women? Well, he would post ads on Craigslist seeking young, attractive women to star in movies. These naive women, thinking that the ads were legit, responded to Joseph, and then he would set up flights for them, which were all paid for by the monster himself. His assistant, Shawnee Lucier, would comfort the mothers of these girls who were obviously terrified of sending them to a big city like New York on their own. She would tell the mothers that the girls would be taken care of, when in reality, she was an accomplice in all of this. It is just disgusting. Well, Joseph was indicted on June 23rd of 2009 on close to 100 charges, and the prosecutors were actually looking to add more charges to this already growing list. But Joseph, 2 years later, on May 22nd of 2011, was found lifeless in his prison cell. He'd taken his own life, and he took his chance away of being punished for his heinous crimes, for blindsiding and traumatizing these young women for the rest of their lives. It is so unsettling to think that Nicholas's dad was like this, and now he's also behind bars. Whether it was premeditated or not, Nicholas took the life of a young woman who had so much ambition, love, and generosity in her, all because she wasn't going to put up with his cheating and money leeching. It's so sad to think that Sylvie, a woman who was driven, smart, and loyal, lost her life like that, and at the hands of someone she loved once upon a time. The holiday season is officially here, and I don't know about you, but I always seem to have a difficult time picking out gifts for pretty much everyone I know. Some people are simpler than others, but most aren't. But that's why I partnered with Uncommon Goods. Uncommon Goods is an online marketplace that specializes in handmade, original, and meaningful gifts. This isn't stuff you can just run to buy at your local supermarket. They partner with independent artists as well as small businesses to provide tons of high quality and often customizable gifts for the people you love. I shopped around on Uncommon Goods and found some really cool gifts for my wife, and I'll be honest, myself too. We both love to cook, so the first thing I found was this amazing Himalayan salt block. You can use blocks like this to roast vegetables, spices, all sorts of stuff, and it really helps bring out the flavor in whatever you're cooking. I also got these really cool grilling planks. This multi-pack comes with a variety of different woods to choose from, and you can roast pretty much any of your favorite foods on top of these planks and infuse your meals with flavors of maple, cherry, hickory, all the best cooking woods. And finally, I found this really interesting cast iron potato baker. You just put your potatoes inside, cook them for about 45 minutes around 400 degrees, and you end up with perfectly baked potatoes every time. Long story short, Uncommon Goods is a great place to find some amazingly unique gifts at affordable prices. So make your holiday season unforgettable with Uncommon Goods. You can use the link in the description below for 15% off your next gift purchase. Thanks to Uncommon Goods for sponsoring today's video. It's September 15th, 2014 in Koh Tao, Thailand. The sun has just risen. The weather is pleasant. It's humid, but there's a fresh ocean breeze cooling everyone down. People are flocking to the shore of the Sairi beach. They're putting down their beach towels, sunbathing, and having a great time under the blue sky and listening to the gently crashing waves nearby. Some are even nursing pina coladas while admiring the view. There are people everywhere. Locals, tourists, and even journalists. The scene looks like a vacation from your dreams, right? But there's also another group of people at the same place. And from the looks of it, they don't look like they're dressed for vacation. They're not in swimming trunks or bathing suits. They're wearing police uniforms. They're investigating a crime smack dab in the middle of the beach where people are gathered. The very place where people are sipping on beverages and sunbathing is the place where 2 bodies have been found. And now the whole crime scene is contaminated. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I post new true crime documentaries every single week. So if you're interested in simple, classic true crime without a bunch of new wave hoopla, then you've come to the right place. And while you're here, consider hitting that subscribe button. It's completely free and just keeps you up to date with all of my future videos. Hannah Witheridge was a 23-year-old young woman from Hemsby, England, who was really fond of backpacking and adventuring. She wanted to work for children in the field of education, so it was only fitting that she enrolled in the University of East Anglia, where she graduated with a degree in education. But she wasn't done. Hannah then got into the University of Essex, where she started her postgraduate studies in speech and language therapy. Not only did Hannah have dreams of becoming an educator for younger children, but she specifically wanted to focus on those that had disabilities and disadvantages. But before she could really take the plunge into the field of education, Hannah opted for a peaceful getaway. On August 25th of 2014, Hannah packed her bags and booked a flight to Thailand, specifically Koh Tao, which is a very attractive spot for tourists from all over the world. Hannah was not new to backpacking. She loved the concept, and she wanted to explore Thailand while on a much-needed break from her studies. So she went to Koh Tao with 3 of her friends, and they planned to have a great time there. On September 14th of 2014, Hannah and her friends made plans to go to a bar called AC Bar, where they would drink, eat, and have a fun night out. Now this bar was a hot spot for tourists. It was a Saturday, and the bar was brimming with people. It was there where Hannah crossed paths with yet another foreigner, and his name was David Miller. David Miller was from Jersey, which was an offshore island territory located between England and France. He was 24 at the time, and family and friends defined David as a colorful character. David worked as an intern for a mining company, and he'd been stationed in Australia for a while. He was actually returning home when he made a stop in Thailand with some friends for a little vacation. Koh Tao, also known as Turtle Island, is located in the Gulf of Thailand, being the smallest of the 3 islands there. Koh Tao is about 8 square miles in area, and the population as of 2024 is around 8,000. Now, even though Koh Tao is beautiful and serene, it's also home to many Burmese people too, which sounds great, but the thing is, they lived in Koh Tao illegally. They weren't allowed to be there, but they bribed the Thai detectives with a couple hundred baht a month to let them stay there, because there were more opportunities for them in Koh Tao than compared to Myanmar. Burmese workers lived there with friends and acquaintances, and identifying them was harder than you may think. They easily blended in with the rest of the locals, but despite the high levels of immigration crime, Koh Tao was still extremely safe, and there hadn't been any violent crimes on the island in the last 8 years. And that may not sound like much, but that is an incredible feat, especially for a tourist destination like this. But just because nothing happened 8 years ago doesn't mean that it won't ever happen again. And tragically, the holiday that was supposed to be a relaxing getaway for both Hannah and David turned out to be the complete opposite. Now, we know that David and Hannah didn't know each other until they arrived at Koh Tao. Some sources claim that they met at their hotel, while others claim that they met at a local bar. But whatever the case, our story begins at the AC bar, after David and Hannah had already met and hit it off. Now, this bar was full of travelers and tourists, and everyone seemed to be having a great time. The evening carried on between Hannah and David until after midnight, when CCTV footage showed the two leaving the bar together without their friends at around 1 a.m. This is the last footage of the two tourists, because a couple hours later, David and Hannah's partially disrobed and badly beaten bodies would be discovered on Sairi Beach between 4 and 5 a.m. Now, this may sound like a sudden jump in the story, but to locals, this was exactly how things played out. It was as if everything was perfectly fine, and then it wasn't. The discovery of the crime scene was actually made by a mute beach cleaner who just happened to be walking by when he spotted the bodies. One body was in the water, while the other lay on the shore. There was a pile of clothes nearby, and it didn't take long for people to realize that the clothes belonged to Hannah and David. The bodies were found 30 meters away from their hotel, Ocean View Bungalows, where both Hannah, David, and their friends were staying, and the bodies themselves were about 20 meters apart. Locals rushed to pull the bodies out of the water, scared that the rising tide would wash them away beyond reach, and within minutes, the Thai police were called. It was a gruesome scene at an otherwise beautiful beach. The detectives arrived really late, at around 11 a.m., and began their preliminary investigation. By this point, about 5 or 6 hours had already passed, but their first order of business was to scope out the crime scene and find anything out of the ordinary. The police ended up finding a couple of burnt cigarette butts and a used contraceptive near the woman's body. But what they also managed to find were possible murder weapons. And yes, I said that plural, there was more than one murder weapon. First, a hoe was found near the bodies, and it clearly looked like it had been used to strike the victims, because it was covered in red marks and smears. Nearer to the bodies, a wooden club was also found in the same state, and the investigators took these things for DNA testing. The next thing to do was identify the victims, and it didn't take long for the detectives to come up with names. The body in the water was identified as 24-year-old David Miller, and the body on the shore was 23-year-old Hannah Witheridge. Two foreign tourists had met the night before and formed a casual friendship, but were now gone. They were found lifeless, humiliated, and discarded at the beach, which is just awful. But when the autopsy results came out, they were even more devastating. Both Hannah and David were struck in the head multiple times with a heavy object. They had serious wounds on their faces and heads, but even though David's body had not been swept away by the water, it was found that David did have water in his lungs, and a lot of it, which could only mean one thing: that he lost his life via drowning. On the other hand, Hannah's autopsy results confirmed that she'd been violently taken advantage of, which is just heartbreaking. DNA was taken from both of the victims' bodies and sent for testing, but the investigators didn't test the clothes for DNA. While the police were investigating this gruesome and harrowing crime scene, the locals did a good job of blocking the pier so that the perpetrators couldn't make a run for it on boat. But you would think that so much DNA evidence, and with such a small population to work with, that Thai investigators would solve this case and bring justice to the victims. But that wouldn't be the case, because the Thai detectives completely botched this investigation. But whether they did it intentionally or unintentionally, well, that's for you to decide, because there is a lot more to come. Even though Koh Tao was an island with a relatively low crime rate, the local police station only had 6 stationed officers for emergency response missions. Now, this number may seem pretty small, and it is, but if violent crimes don't really happen here, well, you don't really need too many officers just draining tax dollars for no reason. But here's where the real problems start to crop up. When the investigators arrived at the crime scene, they didn't even tape the area off. A crime scene where 2 people had just lost their lives was open to the public, tourists and even journalists. People were walking all over the place and messing things up where potential evidence could have been found. Locals were even snapping pictures of the bodies in the crime scene and posting them online, which is unbelievably disrespectful. To think that the detectives didn't even make an effort to cover the bodies is just sad. The pictures were also discovered by none other than David and Hannah's families, and that was how they found out that their loved ones were attacked so mercilessly and fatally while on vacation. As the investigators were looking into persons of interest and suspects, they were mainly focused on tourists and foreign travelers, or illegal immigrants. The police spokesperson claimed that Thais couldn't commit such a gruesome crime, and these detectives were laser focused on any and every non-local. They questioned everyone, and they suspected anyone except the locals. Hannah and David's friends were also questioned. Other foreigners were questioned, and this debacle even led to a manhunt for a British foreigner who was David's roommate. Now, I don't know why or how, but the investigators were convinced that David's roommate was responsible for the crime. The detectives called it a crime of passion because they thought that the roommate was interested in David, but when he saw David with Hannah, he lost control of his anger and took his life. Well, as quickly as this theory was conjured up, it came crashing down because there was literally no evidence whatsoever to support this claim, and the British tourist was finally free to go. The police, in the meantime, also conducted mass DNA testing, in which swabs were taken from almost 200 island locals. What was interesting was that most of the people the investigators focused on, though, were illegal immigrants. Now, they were still considered locals because they'd been here for so long, but they were in fact living here illegally after all this time. But regardless, after the photos of the crime scene at Koh Tao got leaked onto social media, people all over the world were terrified, and this was a really bad thing for the touristy island. The officials wanted the case to be solved quickly so that the news would quiet down and it could save the island's reputation. After all, if word gets out that Turtle Island is now being called Death Island, well, that wouldn't be good for the tourism business. So the police were racing to get this case closed as quickly as possible. And for some context, Thailand's main source of income comes from tourism. So this incident was a blow to the island's reputation and image in the eyes of the international community. Who would want to visit an island where murderers were still on the loose and killing tourists? Probably no one. This was why the Thai police chief was on the Prime Minister's speed dial in the weeks following the tragic event. The Prime Minister of Thailand at that time would call the police chief almost daily for updates on the investigation, and whether or not the killer or killers had been reprimanded yet. The Prime Minister was breathing down the neck of the police officers, and they had to solve this case quickly. Well, the investigators did the most obvious thing that they could have done, and they checked CCTV footage of the bar and the neighboring areas. Now, you would think that on an island like Koh Tao, where no crime had taken place in the last 8 years, there would be tons of security cameras everywhere. And there were, but most were not working. And the ones that were working, well, let's just say the detectives didn't bother to check every single one of them. But they did check a specific camera near the bar. The footage showed 3 men riding a motorcycle to 7-Eleven on the same night that Hannah and David were fatally attacked, where they bought cigarettes and beer and then headed for Sairi Beach. These 3 men were identified as Mao Mao, Wai Phyo, and Zaw Lin, and they were all illegal Burmese immigrants. The investigators finally had a lead, so they first questioned Mao Mao, and he said that he had driven the 2 guys before leaving them and taking his motorcycle somewhere else, and this was all before the murders. Mao Mao then said that when he came back home, he found the 2 guys asleep. The next day, the police questioned Zaw Lin, and strangely, the investigators were more interested in how he got to Koh Tao illegally than the murder of David and Hannah. But he did have a permit to work on the island of Koh Tao. But despite this, Zaw Lin was still an illegal Burmese immigrant, and because of this, he was arrested and the motorcycle was seized too. The second man, Wai Phyo, was nowhere on the island. The detectives thought that he had fled by boat, so the police tracked him down, and finally, on October 2nd of 2014, Wai Phyo was also arrested. The main suspects in David and Hannah's murder were Wai Phyo and Zaw Lin. Mao Mao was not suspicious to the police since he left the 2 guys before the murders took place. So in the police's minds, no one knew what Wai Phyo and Zaw Lin were up to when they were left alone. Now, the two suspects could not speak Thai, so the police, instead of calling official interpreters, relied on Burmese food vendors to understand what these guys were saying. This was basically how they communicated. The investigators would ask questions in Thai, and the Burmese food vendor, who knew Thai, would relay the information in Burmese to the suspects, and then they would answer back. Well, let me just say this was not the most reliable method to question murder suspects, but the detectives got what they wanted. They had a confession. Pheobe and Zaw Lin had attacked and subsequently murdered David and Hannah. This confession was enough for the investigators to arrest the two men. Finally, there was a break in the case. 2 arrests had been made, and the Thai government couldn't have been happier at how the police handled everything. According to the police, Zaw and Y saw David and Hannah getting cozy with each other at the beach, and this was when they launched an attack on the 2 unsuspecting tourists. The investigators even claimed that the DNA found on Hannah's body, cigarette butts, and murder weapons matched the suspects. To add to it, David's missing cell phone was also found in Zaw's home. The detectives even forced the suspects to reenact the entire scene in front of the media. Now, you would think that these men were responsible for Hannah and David's murders since there was a solid DNA match according to the police, but when a lawyer from Myanmar visited the suspects in jail, he took one look at the men, and his rage for the investigators consumed his entire body. The men were beaten black and blue. Zaw and Y retracted their statements and confessed that the murder confession had been forced out of them. They'd been subjected to terrible abuse by none other than the Thai police, who not only beat them every day, but left them in a freezing room without clothes. They even went as far as threatening to use other inhumane torture methods on them if they didn't confess to the crime. Burmese residents also came forward, and they looked just as miserable. The police were terrible towards these illegal immigrants, and they treated them like actual garbage. Many Burmese residents also showed signs of abuse following the mass DNA testing. And this should really put into perspective how the police felt about illegal immigrants, hence why they were so focused on them being the murderers from the get-go, even though they had no reason to suspect that the crime had been committed by someone who wasn't a legal resident. It gets you wondering, are the people in jail right now really murderers? Or is it just the Thai investigators pinning the crime on Burmese immigrants to hide who really drove Hannah and David to their untimely ends? There was a lot of speculation and anger coming from the world. First of all, everyone thought that the Thai detectives were using Zaw and Y as scapegoats for David and Hannah's murder. The whole instance when the suspects were forced to reenact the murder in front of the media was met by severe backlash from people all over the world because it was just weird. The police chief blatantly denied abusing Pheobe and Zaw Lin during the investigation, even though there was irrefutable evidence that proved this was a lie. Thailand's National Human Rights Commission wanted to look further into these allegations, but the police didn't show up at the scheduled meetings, even when they were called 4 times. With all of this happening, the preparations for the trial were now underway. Zaw and Y's defense team was from Bangkok, and they wanted more time to go through the evidence and the 900-page police report, but this was denied by the court. So you can tell that the defense literally had no time to prepare for how they were going to represent their clients, who people were very quickly realizing weren't the ones who actually killed David and Hannah. To add to the oddness, the 900-page report wasn't even given to the defense until the trial had already begun. In December of 2014, 3 months after David and Hannah's tragic passing, Zaw Lin and Pheobe were each indicted on 5 charges: premeditated murder, killing to conceal a criminal offense, a sexual assault, illegal entry into Thailand, and staying in the country without permission. Y was also charged with stealing David's phone, although it was found in Zaw Lin's home, assuming that that detail is even true. The police could have just planted it there for all we know. It's all just so confusing. The trial began on July 18th of 2015, and it lasted for 18 days. The judge prohibited the public from taking any notes. The prosecution presented DNA evidence, the fact that the suspects were illegal immigrants, and how the murders were carried out. The prosecution believed that both Zaw and Y attacked David first and took his life by drowning him, before turning to Hannah and using the same murder weapons on her and even forcing themselves on her. But the prosecution failed to produce any eyewitnesses to the crime. The defense, on the other hand, claimed that the suspects were framed and they actually weren't the murderers. The defense argued that the investigators botched the investigation from the start, allowed the crime scene to be tampered with, and even made huge blunders in the DNA collection. The defense argued that the detectives were taking advantage of the fact that Zaw and Y were vulnerable illegal immigrants, and that they were basically scapegoated for a crime they didn't even commit. The defense stated that Y and Zaw went for a swim in the water, and when they came out, they realized their clothes were missing. This caused the pair to walk to Mau Mau's house, and that's when they were captured on CCTV. As for the phone, the defense argued that Y found an abandoned phone at the beach and just decided to keep it, and that's why it was found in possession of the two men. As for Y supposedly making a run for it on a boat, well, the day that he was arrested, as police had originally claimed, he was actually going to a different island for a new job that he had accepted. The defense also didn't have any witnesses during their statements, the main reason being that people were afraid of coming forward because they feared that they would get punished and tortured by the Thai investigators if they opened their mouths. But finally, on July 10th, the court ordered the DNA to be retested, and this was when it was found out that the DNA on the murder weapons didn't match Y or Zaw. It's just mind-boggling to think that the police could frame two innocent people for murder just because they're illegal immigrants. An Australian forensic scientist, Jane Topin, volunteered to testify at the trial with her own independent findings. Her claims were based on the fact that the investigators rushed the whole DNA testing process because gathering and identifying mixed DNA was hard and time-consuming. But the detectives had results in their hands somehow within 12 hours. This would have been virtually impossible. But ultimately, she was not allowed to appear at the trial because it was thought that foreign experts and their testimony could lead to a biased decision, and therefore undermine the Thai justice system. A different way to look at this would be, look, we know you're right, we know we're wrong, but we're going to do whatever we want anyway. But in the end, on December 24th, 2015, both Y. Pheobe and Zaw Lin were found guilty of murdering Hannah Witheridge and David Miller, and they were sentenced to death, even though recent DNA testing said otherwise. The defense tried to appeal the case twice, once in 2017 and then in 2019, but both times the conviction was upheld. It was only on August 15th of 2020 that Zaw and Y's death sentences were changed to life imprisonment. And why, you might ask? Well, it was the Thai king's birthday, and the change of the decision was a way for the king to show mercy and leniency to Zaw and Y, if you could even call it that. This whole case is just insane to think about. This investigation was criticized all over the world. The fact that Zaw and Y didn't have legal counsel before they confessed to the crime, the language barrier, and the very messy DNA testing situation leads a lot of people to believe that the Thai investigators framed two innocent people in David and Hannah's murder, while the real murderer or murderers are walking free. Truth be told, the people that believe this probably aren't wrong. All the evidence suggests that investigators knew good and well that these men were not the killers, but they prosecuted them anyway. It's been 10 years since Zaw and Y were sentenced for murder. A lot of residents on the island speculate that the investigators are covering for the local mafia, which controls everything on the island. Also, even after David and Hannah's tragic murders, the island continued to experience mysterious and unsolved deaths for many foreign travelers. So it really begs the question, is the Thai law enforcement department really protecting the wrongdoers? It is a haunting question and an even scarier thing to think about. When I first suggested covering this case, I thought this was just going to be discussing the murders of Hannah and David, the two main victims in this case. But after digging deeper, I personally believe there are 4 victims in this case, and the criminal behind all of this has never been caught. Unfortunately, situations like this are not isolated incidents. When money gets involved, people are willing to do the most vile things you could imagine. I've mentioned this before, but my entire family used to live in a tourist town. It was basically just common knowledge that the police were covering up crimes simply for the sake of tourism. The year that we finally decided to leave town was the year that my wife and I had seen 3 separate bodies firsthand, and the police covered up all 3 crimes. There wasn't one single news article, not one blog post, not one plea for information. It was as if all the crimes never even happened, but we saw them. Now, my wife worked with a local cop at the time, and when she asked for answers, she was told, "I can't talk about that." That was the end of the story. We saw 3 bodies firsthand. How many more did we not see? How many murders got away simply for the sake of the tourism industry? We moved away about 2 months later. David and Hannah's funerals were held on October 3rd and 10th of 2014, respectively, and their families were crushed, not just by the loss of their loved ones, but by how the investigation was handled. The Thai detectives did close the case, but no one is sure whether the people behind bars even committed any crime at all. To add to the sadness, Hannah's older sister Laura passed away at the age of 30 in 2019. She was pregnant and succumbed to complications during the surgery. Hannah's mom lost 2 daughters in the most tragic of ways. Christophe Borgye was originally from France, and he loved traveling the world. He had that wanderlust bug in him, and he wanted to see the world, so he decided to move from France to the UK in 2007. When he got to the UK, the first order of business was to get a job. So Christophe worked as a flight attendant for Ryanair Airlines, which was honestly the perfect job for him, considering his dream was to travel the world. He would go to different places and work at the same time. It was pretty much a win-win for him. Christophe was living in Liverpool at the time, and he was sofa surfing basically. He lived with friends, colleagues, and acquaintances, and slept on people's couches. Think of it as kind of a permanent couch crashing situation. Christophe was defined as a trusting and hardworking man. He was not a reckless spender, and he was very close to his family back in France. He would talk to his siblings and parents on a regular basis, and things were going pretty well. A work colleague of Christophe suggested that he'd go and live with one of his friends, with whom he played football. So Christophe was introduced to a man named Dominique Kocher, and he offered Christophe a place to stay in Hilton Court in the center of Ellesmere Port. Christophe would stay with 2 housemates, one of whom was Dominique's cousin, Manuel Wagner, and the other was his childhood friend, Sebastian Bindo. Dominique knew Manuel and Sebastian because the 3 were Austrian and had grown up together before moving to the UK. Dominique lived in a different house, which was close to where Christophe was living with Sebastian and Manuel. Now, the living situation was kind of interesting. Dominique claimed that he didn't ask Christophe for rent of any sort, but he did take all of Christophe's monthly income. Why? Well, Dominique promised that he would return all of the money he took from Christophe when he decided to move somewhere else. It's very weird. I mean, why not just take rent? Why would Dominique take all of what Christophe made and keep it safe for him until the day he moved out? Well, Dominique's reason for this arrangement was that Christophe shouldn't trust English banks. This was really bizarre, but apparently Christophe didn't mind the agreement. When I say Christophe was trusting, this is what I mean. He was trusting to a fault, and he really thought that Dominique would keep his word and return all of the money he'd been keeping safe for him. Dominique claimed that that was how things worked in a family group, and that they looked after each other. Just remember this tiny detail because we'll get back to that in a minute. The arrangement worked out well, and Christophe was living in the best room of the house while working his job as a flight attendant. But it was in 2009 that Christophe came to Dominique with news of his own. Christophe was being relocated to Brussels because of his job. And you know what that means. Christophe was moving from this house in Liverpool to Brussels in Belgium, and he needed all of the money that Dominique had been saving for him. That was the deal. Well, Dominique claimed he was happy for Christophe, and even booked him a flight to Dublin. But Christophe would never make that flight. The next day, Christophe went to work, but the day after that, on April 24th, Christophe didn't show up. This really alarmed his coworkers, who were more like friends to Christophe than anything else. He was never late in his entire career as a flight attendant, and even if something came up, then Christophe would have let his boss know beforehand so that arrangements could be made for a backup flight attendant. Well, that didn't happen, and soon Christophe's coworkers involved the police and reported him as missing. He was about to start a new life in Brussels. Where could he be now? And why wasn't he answering his phone? Christophe's family was also worried because if you remember, he would always keep his family back in France updated, but it had now been days and there was no word from Christophe. So the police got to work and they visited the house where Christophe lived with Sebastian and Manuel. And according to them, Christophe disappeared in the dark of the night. They didn't give any explanation. All three men, Dominique, Sebastian, and Manuel, claimed that one day Christophe was here, and the next he was just gone. He just packed his things and left. He didn't tell them where he was going to stay, or what his plans were. Nothing. Christophe's family also reached out to Dominique, asking where he was, but he told them the same thing too. Sometime later, an email was sent to Christophe's family by his own email account, saying that Christophe had gone to China with a woman, whose name he didn't specify in the email, and he intended to start his new life there. The email was assumed to be from Christophe himself, and he told his family not to worry about him too much and that he was safe. But Christophe's family found it really strange. Christophe didn't normally talk like he talked in this email. Also, Christophe's brother, Noel, had a wedding just around the corner, and Christophe promised he'd make it to that wedding no matter what he was up to. Noel waited and waited, but Christophe never showed up. He didn't even call or text to wish his brother a lifetime of happiness. This was really bizarre and unsettling. Later, when Noel's son was born, Christophe didn't reach out either, even though Noel emailed him regularly. This was really strange. I mean, sure, anyone can get hit with that feeling of wanting to start fresh and maybe limiting contact for a while. But missing your brother's wedding and not even calling them on that big day, that was way out of left field. Unbelievably, 4 years would pass, and there wasn't so much as a blip from Christophe. Christophe's family reached out to the Liverpool police and tried their best to keep themselves updated, but there was just no progress. There was literally no evidence that something happened to Christophe. He didn't hint at anything. He wasn't threatened or scared by anyone. It was just one long and grueling missing person case with no answers. But one day, after all this time, someone would basically show up out of the woodwork with a story to tell. And it wasn't a nice one. Christophe's case was still ongoing, but the lack of leads put it at a standstill, a 4-year-long standstill. That was the case until May of 2013, when the police received a phone call from someone. They told the officers on the phone that he wanted to confess to something because it was too much of a burden for him to bear. That person was Sebastian, one of Christophe's housemates. He reached the police station in Ellesmere Port, and what came out of his mouth literally left the police floored and bewildered. Sebastian sat down in the interrogation room, looking lost and disheveled, and he told the police everything. How he, Manuel, and Dominique overpowered and murdered Christophe back in April of 2009. Moreover, Sebastian was more than willing to take the police to the very place where they would find Christophe's body. And things just took a very dark turn. That night, after Sebastian dropped a bombshell in the interrogation room, the police surrounded the house on Hilton Court, where Christophe lived, and in the outhouse or shed, they found a concrete and brick tomb. The walls of the tomb were all bricks, and the top was cemented. The police got to work on removing the cement from the top, and after a while of digging, they saw a tarp. When the police unwrapped the tarp, they found a blanket, and upon unraveling the blanket, officers discovered the remains of 35-year-old Christophe Borgye. So why did Sebastian confess now of all times? Why keep this dark and disturbing secret for over 4 years? Sebastian claimed it was too much for him to keep the secret anymore. He was having nightmares about that fateful night. So what happened that night? Well, Christophe was set to go to Brussels, and he broke the news to Dominique too, in hopes of getting his money back. What Christophe didn't know was that Dominique had spent all of his hard-earned money on himself. Dominique was not saving Christophe's money. He was robbing him of it under this lame pretense, and sadly Christophe was trusting enough to believe him. Dominique was the leader of the group, and he'd rented 2 houses on that same street, and he lived in one with his wife and 3 children, and in the other house lived Manuel, Sebastian, and eventually Christophe. Dominique used to take all of Sebastian and Manuel's money too, and made them do all the chores around the house. We're talking cleaning dishes, cleaning the house, cooking, you name it. If these guys ever needed anything, from clothes to even toothpaste or soap, they would have to ask Dominique for it, and then he would get that for him with their own money. What in the name of modern slavery even is this? How is this even happening? Well, when Christophe came to live with the 2 men, Dominique started scamming him too. He took all of Christophe's money and spent it lavishly on himself. On the day when Christophe approached Dominique and told him about relocating to Brussels, Dominique's brain went haywire. Christophe would soon ask for money, and spoiler alert, Dominique didn't have any of his money because he spent it like it was his own. So Dominique came up with a plan to get rid of Christophe so that he wouldn't get into trouble. This guy's brain works in weird ways. But he gathered Manuel and Sebastian and bought supplies from ASDA, including bricks, a tarp, cement, and knives. Then the three set up what they called a kill room in the kitchen and waited for Christophe to come home. Christophe was working late that day and he was tired. He just wanted to go home, eat some dinner, and get some shut-eye. But tragically, he didn't know he was walking into a trap set up by his own housemates. Christophe noticed the tarp on the kitchen floor, and the men were wearing gloves and overshoes. They announced that all of them were going to deep clean the house, starting with the kitchen, and they told Christophe to get under the sink and start working. Christophe obliged, and as soon as he got under the sink, the attack was launched by the three men. Christophe obviously lost his life. Dominique, Manuel, and Sebastian then cleaned up the kitchen, rolled up the weapons and Christophe's body in a blanket and tarp, and then threw it into that brick box that they'd made outside in the shed, and they poured concrete on top. Dominique then got a hold of Christophe's belongings, and he got rid of them too. And by getting rid of them, I mean that he sold them and kept the cash for himself. His greed is seriously on another level. You won't believe it, but the three men then cleaned up and went to a Mexican restaurant at Cheshire Oaks to just have dinner like they didn't just murder a man a few minutes ago. It's just insane. What is even more infuriating, though, is that Dominique used Christophe's credit card to then buy his wife an anniversary present. But somehow, there's more. Remember that email from Christophe to his family? The one in which Christophe said that he was starting a new life with a woman in China? Well, that email obviously was written by none other than Dominique. He managed to break into Christophe's computer and email account and sent that disturbing email to his family. He deliberately lied to the family of the person he just murdered, intending to throw them off. Dominique really is a jack of all trades, in the worst way. He's a family man by day and a murderer, scammer, and email hacker by night. Well, if all this wasn't bad enough, Sebastian and Manuel then lived in that same house until 2012. They lived in the same house where they murdered an innocent man, and it's not like anything was hidden. The shed was right outside, and inside was the concrete tomb with the body of Christophe, who literally did nothing to provoke the men aside from asking for money that was rightfully his. Later, the trio then moved to Warrington and then to rural Scotland, where they settled in Dumfries. Dominique lived with his family, and the two men lived on their own. I seriously don't know if Dominique's wife knew anything about what her scheming and money-hungry husband had done, but this was around the time when Sebastian was hit with this guilt, and he decided to come clean to the police. I honestly don't know why he didn't do that while he was living in that very house. It's just unbelievable. So the quest was on, and now the police had Sebastian in custody. They just needed to find the rest of them. But in no time, Manuel Wagner and Dominique Kocher were arrested too, and they were brought back to Ellesmere Port for sentencing. And 1 year after Sebastian's confession, his defense argued for diminished responsibility, since he also suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, but the court ultimately dismissed those claims. And in the end, Sebastian was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 14 years served. Also in 2014, Dominique was convicted of murder, but he was cleared of assisting an offender in preventing a lawful burial. So he was only given a life sentence with a minimum of 23 years served. Manuel was initially cleared of assisting an offender in preventing a lawful burial in 2014, when Dominique and Sebastian were convicted and thus left Christophe's family very angry and disappointed, and rightfully so. So the prosecution petitioned for another investigation, and this time, after the investigation concluded in 2017, Manuel Wagner was finally convicted of murder too, and in the end, he was given a life sentence with a minimum of 16 years. Christophe's family was relieved at the sentencing, but they were also heartbroken. They've been searching for answers for the last 4 years, and Dominique, along with Sebastian and Manuel, did them dirty by not only lying about not knowing anything about Christophe's whereabouts, but also pretending to be him by email and writing about his supposed life in China. Christophe's sister, brother, and stepdad worked tirelessly with the police to get closure for this very gruesome and inexplicable murder. And after all was said and done, Christophe's remains were sent to France, and he was laid to rest beside his mom in his hometown. This case seriously shook law enforcement to their core. How 3 men evaded the law for 4 years, and how callously they murdered an innocent man who was on his way to live his dream life is just devastating and chilling at the same time. When you combine this with all the mind games, the theft, all of it, it just leaves you heartbroken. Heartbroken not just for Christophe's family, but more so for how Christophe was cheated, lied to, and manipulated in his last few months on Earth, then ultimately betrayed by his own supposed friends and roommates. Detectives are spying on a man eating pizza on a busy street corner in downtown Manhattan. From our perspective, it might look weird to witness the police burning a hole into the back of this man's head, who just looks like he's enjoying his lunch. But the police aren't eyeing the pizza. Well, they are, but not for the reason you might think. The investigators want the man's DNA from the pizza crust. And finally, the man tosses the pizza out and heads back to work for the afternoon. Police jump in and grab the pizza from the trash, and the man has no idea. But detectives are trying to pin him to a vicious crime. That's because this man just claimed the lives of 4 women, and he nearly got away with it, if it weren't for his love of pizza. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I'm your host, Ty Knotts, and I post new true crime documentaries every single week, often multiple times a week. So if you're interested in classic true crime, hit that subscribe button. It's 100% free, and it just lets you know when I post new cases. Between July of 2007 and September of 2010, 4 women went missing in New York. As time went on, the disappearances were analyzed side by side, and investigators were certain they were connected. The cases of these women were baffling, and no one knew where the women could be. And it wasn't until 2010 when, tragically, their bodies were discovered in a remote beach town called Gilgo. When that happened, the strange and unsettling disappearances turned homicides of the women were dubbed the Gilgo Murders, and the unfortunate women involved were called the Gilgo Four. So, who were the Gilgo Four? Well, aside from them being women who were all adored and cared for by their families and loved ones, they all had a few things in common. All of the women were in their 20s, had a petite build, and were also offering certain services on Craigslist at the time of their disappearance. The country was in a recession at the time, so I guess you gotta make money where you can, and it's not like they enjoyed their jobs, they were just doing their best not to end up living on the streets or eating out of a dumpster. Regardless, this realization that each of the women had so much in common ultimately led the detectives to think that the murders were the doings of a serial killer. And well, they didn't know it back then, but they would be right. And what was even worse is that that very serial killer had taken the lives of several women before and even after the Gilgo Four. The reign of terror started all the way back in November of 1993 and lasted until 2011. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. First, we need to start in 2007, when the first of the 4 victims went missing. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was an intellectual and artist, 25 years old, and she was from Norwich, Connecticut, and she was devoted to her friends and family. She was a mother of 2 children, one of whom was 7 at the time of her disappearance. Maureen worked as a seasonal telemarketer, but she was eventually fired from her job and was on the verge of getting evicted. This caused her to turn to adult work to provide for her daughter. It's not a job any of us are likely to agree with, but Maureen felt she was backed into a corner, and considering she had bills due immediately, she didn't know of any other way to make a lot of money and make it fast. Maureen was last seen on July 7th of 2007, when she planned to spend a day in New York. She'd called a friend before her disappearance, telling her how she was supposed to meet a client outside the Super 8 motel in Manhattan, but she was never seen again. Her family reported her missing, but there would be no leads or promising information for the time being, and her case went cold. 2 years later, 24-year-old Melissa Bartholomew went missing on July 12th of 2009. She was originally from Erie County, New York, but at the time she was living in a basement apartment in the Bronx. Melissa had left behind her mother and 15-year-old sister, who were concerned when she failed to reach out to them for the next couple of days. Melissa's mom eventually reported her daughter missing on July 18th, and according to a close friend of Melissa's, she was due to meet a man and promised to be back in the morning. But she never returned. Less than a year later, another woman went missing, and she was 22-year-old Megan Waterman. Megan was from Scarborough, Maine, and she was a mother of a 3-year-old daughter named Lily. Megan was last seen on June 6th of 2010 at around 1:30 a.m. on surveillance, leaving a Holiday Inn Express in Long Island to meet a client. Even though Megan was away from her daughter in Maine, who was living with Megan's mom, Lorraine, she would call her daily and catch up. But that didn't happen after June 6th. She wasn't picking up her phone, and hearing complete silence from her daughter compelled Lorraine to eventually report her missing on June 8th. The next and final disappearance of the Gilgo Four was just months after Megan went missing in September of 2010. Even though no one knew it at the time that the killings were connected, the timeline is just terrifying. You can tell that the serial killer is targeting victims one after another, and the cooldown period, or time between each attack, is getting shorter and shorter. This time, a woman named Amber Lynn Costello from West Babylon, New York, went missing. She was an excellent student raised in South Carolina, but for some reason she fell into a life of addiction and never really came out. She even worked as a waitress at one point, but she eventually turned to adult work to pay the bills. It was reported that Amber was approached by a potential client who was going to pay her $2,500 for her services, which was way more than her usual rate. She didn't really know what the guy wanted to do in exchange for so much money, but for Amber, this lump sum could have been her ticket out of this lifestyle once and for all. Just one more night, one more job, and it would all be over. The thing is, Amber was right. It would soon all be over, but not the way she had hoped. Amber's friend, David Schaller, remembered Amber telling them that this high-paying client had a green Chevrolet Avalanche, and he was a huge guy, about 6 foot 4 inches tall, and he wore very large oval-shaped glasses. In short, David said that the client looked like an ogre. But that's all the information he knew about him. Before anyone knew it, Amber was missing. These disappearances were very confusing for the police, but soon they would find answers, or rather the victims themselves. And this would leave everyone terrified. So the location where these 4 women had disappeared was a mystery for a long time, until May 1st of 2010, when another woman in distress called the police. Tragically, she wouldn't survive either, but her disappearance set off a chain of events that eventually led the investigators to Gilgo Beach. The concerned woman was 24-year-old Shannon Gilbert, another adult worker, who called 911 on May 1st at about 4:50 a.m. She was going to a house in Oak Beach on Jones Beach Island in Suffolk County when the call was made. On the call, she sounded hysterical and scared, and you could hear panting as if she was running from someone. On the call, Shannon told the operator that, quote, they were trying to kill her. Tragically, the call was disconnected, but not before Shannon screamed at the top of her lungs for help. Her disappearance was also left unanswered until June, when the Suffolk County Police Department's Missing Person Bureau assigned Officer John Malia to search the area where Shannon was last seen, and found some clues. Officer Malia, along with the cadaver dog Blue, searched for months before they finally hit a jackpot on December 11th of 2010. Officer Malia searched the vast area close to the beach, and even though it was covered in snow and the path was impossible to walk on thanks to the vegetation, the cadaver dog Blue alerted the officer of the scent coming from underneath the snow. When the area was further searched, a burlap sack was discovered. When officers opened the sack, well, as usual, they thought it may have been a mannequin. But as we all know, it's never a mannequin. A bound body was found inside that bag. At the time, no one knew who it was, but little did they know that they were close to unraveling the truth of what happened to the Gilgo Four. The first set of remains was positively identified as those of Melissa Bartholomew. Further searches revealed more human remains, and by the end of the search, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello's remains were all found about 500 feet apart from one another. And disturbingly, all of the women were bound by leather belts and wrapped in a unique hunting sack made of burlap. In March of 2011, the investigators were in for more surprises though, because Gilgo Beach hid more than just the remains of the Gilgo Four. By April of 2011, more human remains were found along Ocean Parkway that would later be identified as Jessica Taylor, a woman who went missing in July of 2003. Then the remains of Tatiana Dykes and Valerie Mack would also be found. Remains of 2 more women, identified as Tanya Jackson and Karen Vergata, were also found in that same area too, a few hundred feet apart from the rest of the women. Tanya's and Tatiana's DNA actually matched, and the detectives figured out that Tanya was Tatiana's mom, which adds an entirely different, much darker layer to this story. Karen was yet again another street worker, and she went missing back in 1996. Also, another unidentified body was found near Gilgo Beach. Interestingly, DNA results showed that the person was an Asian male but was wearing female clothing. The body was ultimately named Asian Doe, and the person lost their life by blunt force trauma. But remember the name Shannon Gilbert, the one that called 911 that night, screaming? Well, her body was also found 19 months following her disappearance, in a marsh between Oak Beach and Ocean Parkway. But there was one problem. Her cause of death was debatable. It was concluded that Shannon had lost her life by tripping into the marsh and drowning. But in 2016, the autopsy revealed that Shannon's death was intentional. The thing is, Shannon's mom, Mary Gilbert, who's since passed away, had previously expressed her anger with the investigators and stressed that her daughter could have been drowned by the serial killer, for all that anyone knew. She never knew how right she truly was. Despite this, Shannon's cause of death was officially reported as undetermined. So Gilgo Beach became a haunting graveyard and a place of terror for the people of Suffolk County. Sure, it was a secluded beach, and no one really came down here, but the fact that it was a place where so many people were found deceased sent chills down everyone's spines. So the police as well as the FBI joined forces and aimed to bring this crime spree to an end. When a task force was made, they decided to look into phone records, and for simplicity, the investigators decided to focus mostly on the Gilgo 4 for now. Well, when they came across phone calls made to the victims, they found some disturbing details. An unknown number traced to Madison Square Garden called the Gilgo 4's family members, and these calls came right after each of the 4 women went missing. This couldn't have been a simple coincidence, and the police were now ready to make their first move. The calls the family received from this unknown phone number were highly disturbing, and the caller, a man, would make very derogatory remarks about the victims and their professions. But what was so chilling was that the mysterious caller would further taunt the victims' families and tell them that the women were no longer alive because, quote, they had killed them. Following this revelation, the investigators also decided to run DNA tests on any evidence found on the bodies of the Gilgo 4 victims. And that was when they got some very promising information. See, several women found on Gilgo Beach, specifically Megan Waterman, had strands of hair on their bodies. They weren't long, and from the looks of it, they belonged to a male. So the detective decided to test the hair's DNA. The results didn't match anyone in the system, but this very DNA would soon lead to a person of interest, or rather, a suspect. Another cold case of a woman named Sandra Castillo, who went missing in 1993, took place in the area, and her remains were found in a wooded area in North Sea, Long Island, about 60 miles northeast of Gilgo Beach, in November of 1993. Surprisingly, there were hair strands on her body as well, and when those were tested, the results came out as a match to the strands found on Megan's body. So now, the crimes were certainly connected, and the investigators had rock-solid evidence. The Gilgo 4, Sandra, and possibly all the other victims were murdered by the same person. What's so heartbreaking is that Megan was forced into adult work by her boyfriend-turned-manager, Akeem. To make matters worse, Akeem was also physically abusive towards Megan and forced her to pick up work in New York because, quote, she would get paid more. Akeem was eventually arrested on unrelated drug charges later on. Megan left her child with her mom, Lorraine, in hopes of making a better life in New York. But who knew that moving to New York would be the ticket to her untimely end? Megan just wanted to give her daughter a better life, just like all the other victims. And it's just heartbreaking that Megan ended up choosing this line of work and in the end, crossing paths with a serial killer. As tragic as Megan's story was, the presence of the murderer's DNA on her body eventually led the police to connect some major breadcrumbs to follow. The investigators looked into the information of the murderer driving a dark green first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche and his big, burly appearance. Eventually, this information was another breakthrough in this complex case, and it led the detectives straight to Midtown Manhattan, where a successful architect would be on the investigators' radar. Based on phone records and witnesses, the investigators tracked down a successful architect named Rex Howerman and he soon was named as a suspect in the murders of the Gilgo Four, as well as the other missing women whose remains were found at Gilgo Beach. Rex lived in Massapequa Park on the south shore of Long Island, and most of his life he worked in Midtown Manhattan at his architectural firm RH Consultants and Associates, at least since 1987. Turns out the calls made to the victims' families were traced to these very places. To everyone's suspicion and intrigue, Rex also drove a dark green first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche, which was conveniently in South Carolina at the time the police got to him. He was over 6 foot tall. He had a burly appearance and wore large, oval-shaped glasses. I mean, what are the odds? But from the looks of it, Rex looked like a family man. He lived in his humble abode with his wife, Asa, and 2 children, one of whom was Asa's daughter from a previous relationship. He looked like an ordinary man in his 50s building a successful architectural empire. But looks can be deceiving. And Rex here had mastered the art of masking his real, terrifying face behind his bookish and smart appearance. Growing up, Rex had bad luck with girls, and he was constantly rejected. But again, he never lashed out or even got into fights with other students, even though he was built like a giant. Rex did have one thing going for him, though. He was very smart, which led him to become a successful businessman in the 1980s. Rex was also fond of hunting. Now, nothing is alarming here. I'm sure a lot of people love the sport, but to the police, this information perked their ears up. See, the missing women were found bound with leather belts, and their bodies were wrapped in a specific type of burlap sack that hunters normally used. To add to this, there was DNA evidence, which was the golden ticket for the police. But they needed to get their hands on Rex's DNA. So the investigators decided to follow Rex in Manhattan, and one fateful day, Rex was eating a pizza, and he threw the box in the trash near his workplace. The detectives pounced on this pizza box and sent it for DNA testing. Well, Rex's DNA matched the hair found on Megan and Sandra's bodies. Rex was their guy. Further investigation led to some very interesting information to surface. Rex's employees at RH Consultants and Associates had an inkling that Rex was kind of weird. He was very fond of hunting weak, defenseless prey, and he was borderline stalkerish. One employee of Rex's reported that Rex had found out she was on vacation on a cruise, and Rex thought it was a bright idea to slip a note under the door of her cabin that read, "You know I can find you anywhere." Now, I don't know about you, but that would be enough for me to just leave that job immediately, no matter how well they paid. But anyway, this left the female employee very unsettled, but that was that. Well, later on, the investigators were able to find the exact Chevrolet Avalanche in Chester, South Carolina, where Rex also had property. So it seemed as though the police were at the finish line, and all they had to do was arrest Rex before he got away. Well, on July 13th, 2023, Rex Hauerman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of second-degree murder in relation to Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello's murders. He was also eventually named a prime suspect in the disappearance of Maureen Brainerd Barnes and her subsequent murder, for which he was charged in January of 2024, after more incriminating evidence came out. But fast forward to June 6th of 2024, Rex was arraigned and charged with the murders of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Castilla. Then, in December of 2024, he was also indicted for the murder of Valerie Mack. It's believed that Rex used Craigslist to find his victims, and he had a specific type that he would target. Although we don't know why Rex only targeted young, petite women who were also adult workers, it's unsettling nonetheless. It took the investigators more than a decade to find human remains at Gilgo Beach in 2011 and 2010, and they finally linked all of these unsolved and terrifying murders to Rex, which ultimately led to his arrest in 2023. But there's another plot twist. See, when the detectives were gathering DNA evidence from the remains, they found strands of longer hair on some of the victims too, specifically on the leather belts. Those long hair strands positively matched Rex's wife, Asa. So the police were also suspicious of his wife in the beginning. Was she an accomplice to the murders? Did the couple work together to lure victims and then take their lives? But this theory soon hit a wall when the investigators went ahead and talked to Asa for themselves and found out how clueless and alarmed she was to find out her husband was living a secret double life. It was at that moment when the investigators thought that Asa's DNA was probably just there via contact. Rex probably transferred Asa's as well as her daughter Victoria's DNA from himself onto the victims. And yes, you heard that right, even Victoria's DNA was found on the leather belts, which is bizarre, but she was just a child back when these murders occurred, so there's no way that Victoria, or Asa for that matter, had a hand in the killings. Moreover, Asa and the rest of Rex's family were on vacation out of state when most of the murders occurred, so it seemed like Rex acted all alone. It could be as simple as a domestic transfer, or it could also be something darker. What if Rex had deliberately put his wife and daughter's DNA on the victims to throw the investigators off and make them suspicious of Asa instead? Now, this is just an accusation. There's no evidence to really suggest this, but it's an interesting thought nonetheless. The detectives also managed to recover mirror selfies of Rex that he used on Craigslist to get the services of adult workers. The investigators believed he would go to Craigslist, find victims that fit his criteria, and then lure them to shady hotels, motels, and even houses where he would end their lives with his bare hands or with a heavy object while the victims were bound. He would then wrap their bodies in burlap and toss them near Gilgo Beach, thinking that no one would suspect them to be there for a long time. It's so frightening that Rex was out there, targeting young defenseless women like prey since the 90s, and he got away with it for so long. As of December of 2024, at the end of this long investigation by the Suffolk County Police Department and the FBI, Rex was charged with the murders of 7 women: Amber Costello, Megan Waterman, Melissa Bartholomew, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Sandra Castilla, Jessica Taylor, and Valerie Mack. Rex was then dubbed the Long Island serial killer in the media following his arrest. Rex is awaiting trial in Riverhead Correctional Facility in Suffolk County. He's pleaded not guilty to all charges, and his defense attorney stated that Rex didn't commit any of these crimes. Rex's attorney recently requested the 7 charges to be split into 5 different trials, but this was thankfully denied by a Suffolk County courthouse judge. Rex's attorney also wants the judge to block the DNA evidence, which is crucial for linking Rex to the crime because the testing methods were not used before in a New York courtroom. Even though the trial date hasn't been announced yet, it's possible that it can take place any time this year. Rex Hauerman is a calculated and pompous serial killer who didn't only target women, but also had the audacity to taunt the victims' families. Megan's remains were the reason for the breakthrough in the case, because it not only led to substantial DNA evidence, but also linked the perpetrator to a cold case back in 1993, hence leading it to the road of completion. Even though all the women Rex had targeted weren't working ideal jobs, it doesn't mean they were any less human than any other person on the planet. They had families, they had children, and they had friends. Yes, life had beat them down, but they were still loved and cared for by their close friends and family. Megan's mom, Lorraine, battled substance abuse, but she got clean and took care of her granddaughter, Lily, who's now an esthetician working in her own company. Lay back with Lily. Lorraine passed away in 2022 after battling cancer, and she tragically didn't get the satisfaction of seeing her daughter's killer get caught. Amber, Melissa, Maureen, Megan, Sandra, Jessica, Valerie, Karen, Tanya, Tatiana, and Shannon were all loving and caring women, and their families missed them tremendously. Some family members have passed away in search of answers, while some are still out there, hoping that the perpetrator gets the punishment he deserves for attacking and taking the lives of these women. But these are just the women who are on record of being Rex's victims. We don't know how many more women or people Rex had targeted in reality, so we can only hope that he gets the highest possible sentence and punishment, because none of these women deserved what happened to them. A gray Hyundai iX35 is declared a crime scene, along with a house that doubles as a garbage dump. But there's something weird about this car. First off, the license plate is wrong. It's been switched out. When detectives took a closer look at the car, they found the Hyundai logo had also been swapped with a Toyota one that was made out of paper. Police had been looking for a missing person, 17-year-old Pheobe Bishop, and this strange car was their only lead. Phoebe had been on her way out of town, heading to the airport to catch a flight. But Phoebe would never reach the airport, and she wouldn't board her flight. And the search for this missing woman was now on. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I'm your host, Ty Knotts, and I post new true crime documentaries every single week, often multiple times a week. So if you're interested in classic true crime, hit that subscribe button. It's 100% free and just lets you know when I post new cases. Phoebe Bishop, better known as Fee by her mom, Kylie Johnson, was born in Queensland, Australia. Phoebe was a lively, charismatic, and sassy young girl, as her mom, Kylie, states, and she kind of followed her own beat to life. Phoebe loved cars and traveling, and according to her boyfriend, 18-year-old Levi, she was very much into photography, so much so that Levi had bought her a digital camera and was going to give it to her the next time they met. Now, Phoebe had a complicated history with her family. Although we don't really know the details, at the time of this case, she wasn't actually living with her parents. It's reported that she didn't really have a stable childhood and that she and her sister Kaylee were working as cleaners in the National Disability Insurance Scheme, or the NDIS. Now, it's not confirmed whether Phoebe had a disability or not, but one of the requirements for working in the NDIS is that the person should have a disability caused by a permanent impairment. But ultimately, that's neither here nor there. According to Phoebe's sister Kaylee, the sisters were just looking for places to live together. But eventually, Phoebe moved out of the family home alone, and she ended up living with two housemates, a man named James Wood and a woman named Tanika Bromley, in a house in Gengin. Now, I want to stress that Phoebe didn't personally know Tanika and James. It was actually Phoebe's mom who previously worked with Tanika. So Phoebe and her two housemates, who were more acquaintances or strangers to her, were now living in a house in Gengin. And even though Phoebe had moved out of her family home, she still kept in touch with her mom and siblings all the time. Regardless of living with a couple of people that she barely knew, Phoebe made the best of the situation and largely didn't seem bothered by the arrangement. But that sentiment would quickly change, because one day, in May of 2025, completely out of the blue, Phoebe disappeared, never to be seen again. Prior to her disappearance, Phoebe actually had plans to meet her boyfriend Levi in Western Australia. Phoebe was fond of traveling, and she wanted to explore more places outside of the rural town of Gengin. Phoebe even said in various social media posts that Gengin was a sad place and she didn't belong here. So she packed her bags for her flights from Bundaberg to Brisbane, and then to Western Australia. Phoebe was last seen on the morning of May 15, 2025, at about 8:30 a.m. Security footage caught Phoebe carrying her luggage at Airport Drive in Bundaberg. She was wearing a green tank top and gray sweatpants. You would think that if she was so close to the airport that she would have made it. But when the Queensland police checked the flight records, Phoebe hadn't checked in for her flight to Western Australia, and she'd not been seen since. 17-year-old Phoebe was then reported missing on May 18th after she failed to answer her phone or reply to texts from her family. The detectives immediately launched an investigation for a missing person, and they decided to look into the details because, well, nothing made sense. This was all so sudden, and it was a relatively safe place, all things considered. So this whole situation was just bizarre. She was on her way to the airport. She was literally minutes away from that airport, but she never arrived at the terminal. She didn't check her luggage in, she didn't get her boarding pass. The investigators checked every single piece of security footage at that airport, just to see if they missed Phoebe by any chance, but there was no sign of her. So the Queensland police decided to backtrack a bit and look into the footage of Phoebe on Airport Drive, and that was when they uncovered more details. Phoebe was seen being driven in a gray Hyundai iX35. Now, this was the exact same type of car that Phoebe's housemates had, so it's assumed they must have been the ones driving her that day. So they decided to give them a visit and just ask some routine questions. But when they reached that house in Gengin, something was wrong. It was as if they walked into a pile of filth. This house did not look like a house, it looked like a makeshift garbage dump. To put it plainly, this place was barely even habitable. It was just gross. The front of the house was piled with trash, and it looked like it hadn't been picked up in weeks, if not maybe even months. Little did the investigators know, though, the inside of the house would be much worse and even more disgusting. Something was amiss, and the detectives had a very bad feeling about all of this. Upon knocking on the door to this disgusting house, the police were greeted by 34-year-old James Wood and 33-year-old Tanika Bromley, and they were pretty cooperative with the detectives at least in the beginning. They told the investigators at around 8:30 a.m. Tanika and James had driven Pheobe to the airport, and when they were about 1 kilometer or so away from the actual terminal, Pheobe received a phone call from Levi, her boyfriend. According to James and Tanika, Pheobe and Levi got into a very heated argument, to the point where Pheobe was extremely shaken up and very edgy. So the couple decided to stop the car for a bit, and James and Tanika got out of the car to give Pheobe some space. James and Tanika claimed that after about 5 to 7 minutes, they returned to the car, but were stunned when they realized it was empty. Pheobe was gone, and so was her luggage. So James and Tanika assumed that Pheobe went to the airport by herself and caught her flight. They didn't bother to check up on her, to call her, or even make the short drive to the airport to see if she was okay. They just assumed that Pheobe had left, so they drove home. Now, this sounded as bizarre to the detectives as it probably does to you. I mean, sure, they weren't besties or something, they were just housemates, but Tanika and James were supposed to drop her off at the airport. The least they could do was just ensure Pheobe reached the terminal if they found the car deserted. Another thing the police deemed suspicious was the fact that Pheobe was never seen reaching the airport. If what James and Tanika were saying was true, then Pheobe should have been seen by airport security or people just walking around, or even caught on camera walking with her luggage in a cab. But she wasn't, which only made James and Tanika more suspicious in the eyes of the police. Moreover, the detectives were revolted as much as they were suspicious, because standing in that house, if you can even call it that, was impossible. Even the landlord said that the air tasted dirty. The scene inside that house was even more horrid. Piles upon piles of trash, ripped food packaging, and dog food were found all over the floor. It didn't look like the house had been cleaned since it was leased months ago. The bed sheets were stained yellow, and the floors were buried underneath piles of trash. The investigators also found some disturbing things. Chains, dog waste, and dog toys were found across the floors all over the home. According to the landlord, James and Tanika had leased the house just 6 months ago, and they pretty much turned the house into a dump of filth, which, if anyone calls a house that, you know it's bad, like really bad. Unsurprisingly, Tanika was given a notice to leave the house after a recent inspection. Even the landlord was confused and repulsed at the fact that this home was in such a bad state. He even questioned how the couple could breathe inside this home, let alone live in it. But as the detectives went outside, they spotted that same Hyundai iX35 that was seen on the Airport Drive security footage. But there was a problem. The license plate wasn't the same. The license plate could clearly be seen in the footage, and it was 414EW3. But now at the house, the car had a completely different number, and it was 474BW8. And this was weird. What was even more off-putting and heartbreaking was the fact that sometime before Phoebe's disappearance, James and Tanika's neighbors complained about a foul odor coming from the home. And when the police came to check, several deceased dogs were found on the property. It was concluded these dogs had died of natural causes inside the home, which is just insane. Neighbors had also complained about the racket of parties and barking and howling of dogs coming from that home all hours of the night that kept them on edge all the time. It was also eventually found out that Tanika and James were dating, but according to James's ex, she came forward and said that James told her that he and Tanika had split up and they were just living together. This whole situation just keeps getting more confusing by the second. But to make things even stranger, James also owned a bus, a big one, and it was parked out front of the home. He was in the process of trying to sell this bus, but according to James's ex, at this moment, he'd been living in the bus rather than in the home. And can you blame him? I mean, there's no way a home like that is safe to be in. Now, neighbors had seen Pheobe go in and out of the house, but they weren't aware that she lived with James and Tanika. I guess they just never saw the two come or go, so they assumed Pheobe was living alone in all this mess. So at this point, even though things were looking odd, the police really had no other evidence or anything incriminating to hold James and Tanika accountable for Phoebe's disappearance. And so the couple was free to go, and the investigation resumed. By May 23rd, 8 days into the search for Pheobe, the detectives searched various areas, and for some reason, they focused on Goodnight Scrub National Park. It was actually Phoebe's phone records that led them there. They had checked Phoebe's phone history, and even though Levi had called Pheobe on the morning of her flight to Western Australia, later when Pheobe had gone missing, it was revealed that that phone had been manually turned off. So the investigators deployed specialist police, including a dive squad, to Goodnight Scrub National Park, as they wanted to conduct land and waterway searches. After hours and hours of searching, police were able to find several pieces of evidence that proved that this park was, from the looks of it, the site of a gruesome crime. Several collections were made here, and evidence was sent in for forensic testing just to be sure, but it was clear from the get-go something dark took place here. While waiting for those forensic tests to come back, the detectives also came to a rather interesting conclusion. The Queensland police were certain that some of the evidence in Goodnight Scrub National Park had been moved before the detectives arrived for their search, and this was really bizarre. They also searched the vast areas with cadaver dogs in hopes of finding anything of value that would give them some sort of clue about where Pheobe may have gone. Well, before long, they found something that would certainly push the case forward, but it was not what they had hoped. While the search in the national park was on, James and Tanika had a run-in with the law. See, garbage, soiled waste, and inedible food weren't the only things in their Gin residence. The investigators had managed to find firearms and ammunition in the home, as well as in the Hyundai iX35. So James and Tanika were ultimately arrested, but they were let out on bail. During this time, the search in the national park had expanded to its outskirts, and on June 6th, the detectives found something, but it would be anything but pleasant. See, on a back road surrounded by dense bushland near Goodnight Scrub National Park, the police discovered human remains. It looked like the remains had been tossed out without a care in the world, and no effort was made to hide the body. It wasn't even buried. When the detectives sent the remains for DNA testing, and the results came back on June 17th, everyone was shocked to the core. The remains were tragically identified as those of 17-year-old Pheobe Bishop, who'd gone missing just less than a month ago. Sure, the investigators had an inkling that the remains could have been Phoebe's, but no one is prepared for that confirmation. And it was such a devastating moment for the detectives as well as Phoebe's family. Since this is a developing case, Phoebe's exact cause of death hasn't been revealed yet. But if I'm being honest, does that really even matter? I know we all have a morbid curiosity about these kinds of things, but remember, this was a 17-year-old girl who was stolen from her family, from her friends, and from everyone who loved her. Her life was ripped from this earth for no good reason, and that is what's important. Well, the police already knew that something was suspicious, and they declared the messy and disgusting house, as well as the Hyundai iX35, as crime scenes. But now that Phoebe's body had been discovered, the case took a very dark turn. It was no longer an investigation to find Pheobe unharmed, it was now a matter of finding Phoebe's killers, and the police, as well as the general public, put their money on the very suspicious housemates, James Wood and Tanika Bromley. The most interesting part of this case is the fact that the suspects in Phoebe's disappearance were arrested before her body was even discovered. Tanika and James were arrested on the morning of June 5th, a day before Phoebe's remains were even found. Tanika was arrested first, and then James was taken into custody sometime later. The detectives also released body cam footage of James getting arrested, and he was wearing tracksuit pants and a shirt, and the detectives were seen telling an emotionless James that he was being arrested for Pheobe Bishop's homicide. Tanika and James were each charged with 1 count of homicide and 2 counts of interfering with a body. Following the couple's arrest, the case was taken to court, but the two decided not to appear for reasons that are unknown. I guess they didn't want to face the possible consequences of their actions, but we really don't know. They're probably going to prison regardless, and their failure to appear essentially secured their guilt, at least in my book. The thing is, since the case is still unfolding, police are obviously being pretty tight-lipped with this information. But that doesn't mean we've been completely left in the dark. In the most recent court hearing, more information about how Pheobe was attacked came out. The police believe that Pheobe was attacked in the same Hyundai iX35 right after she was seen on Airport Drive on May 15th. Although it's unclear exactly what happened to her, the detectives allege that Phoebe's body was moved twice after the crime was committed. Once after she was murdered, and then again about 2 days later, where it was eventually found on that back road near Goodnight Scrub National Park. The police also have evidence that Phoebe's phone was fully charged and online on the morning before the attack, but later it was manually turned off and it was never turned on again, suggesting her phone was most likely taken from her either before or during the attack. But there is one more thing. Remember the Hyundai car with the changed license plate? Well, it turned out the license plate wasn't the only thing that was changed. The Hyundai logo on the backside of the car was changed to that of a Toyota. But I'm not talking about a professional change, such as a different emblem. This part was actually laughable because James and Tanika really thought they could fool the police. The Toyota logo was scribbled onto a strip of paper and then stuck to the back of the car where the Hyundai logo was. It looked like a preschooler did this. And the license plates were also not changed, not literally at least. Tanika and James didn't apply for a legit license plate change, nor did they steal one. The vehicle was still registered to the original license number 414EW3, but the couple had actually used electrical tape and black paint to turn the 1, E, and 3 into 7, B, and 8. Now, I don't know if these two were struggling with mental illness or if they really just were this bad at pulling off a crime, but this is darn near unbelievable. I mean, how many mental backflips did this couple have to come up with to get up with this bright idea? Like it was their master plan of throwing the detectives or the investigation off, but obviously it didn't work. There's no doubt in anyone's mind that Tanika and James are most likely responsible for and are behind Phoebe's murder. But the main question is, why? Well, James did talk to the Daily Mail and stated that Phoebe had a habit of bursting out in anger and had even smashed their TV at one point. During that interview, it was clear to see that this man had some serious resentment toward Phoebe. But remember, these are the words of a clearly, interesting man, as well as a possible murderer, so take all of this with a grain of salt. That TV thing may have never happened, and he could just certainly be lying. You've got to remember as well, James and Tanika are the ones with the house in disgusting condition and deceased animals all over their property. They're the ones with the unexplained possession of firearms and ammunition. They're also literal strangers to Phoebe, so no matter how you look at it, the housemates almost definitely likely had a hand in Phoebe's murder. Also, police claim that they have evidence that Phoebe's body had been moved twice, and they allegedly have evidence that James and Tanika were the ones who moved it. When you tack on the fact that James and Tanika's car was haphazardly disguised after they were spotted on CCTV, the whole paper logo and electrical tape license plate thing, well, I think we all know what happened here and who's responsible. It's also alleged that either the couple, or at least one of them, likely abused Phoebe, because several witnesses at a local store saw Phoebe come into the store a couple of days before her disappearance and eventual murder, and she looked weak and hungry, almost as if she'd been held against her will or something. But what's interesting about these accusations is that if Phoebe had been held against her will, well, she'd been speaking to her boyfriend in the days leading up to her passing, so why wouldn't she have mentioned this to him? My only guess is, if this did truly happen, maybe she was just that fearful of these people. And again, all of this is just assuming the eyewitness statements are proven to be accurate. But also, the whole situation between Phoebe and her family, it's kind of complicated. I mean, why was a 17-year-old girl living with practical strangers? It's reported that Phoebe had a complicated childhood in the sense that she never had a stable father figure. Her family was always moving, and she didn't stay in one school for too long because of these moves. But why didn't she live with her mother or some other family member? The whole situation is just bizarre, and I'm not sure why no one has bothered to clarify this. It just seems strange to me, but maybe I'm just looking too far into it. It could be as simple as she didn't get along with her mom, and being 17, she just wanted to try something new. But Phoebe's social media was also a very sad depiction of what she was going through. Her last TikTok video was about having a conversation with her younger self. She also mentioned her dad at one point, and how when she passes away, she wants her dad to help lower her coffin so that he can let her down one last time. Now, I get this was most likely some kind of dark humor, but there was clearly some truth to the pain in those words. Of course, we can't decode whatever Phoebe was feeling at that time, but she was obviously feeling, at a bare minimum, sad and down. Phoebe's mom, Kylie, was very emotional following her daughter's disappearance, and she just wanted answers. She was active on social media and on news stations, begging for any updates on Phoebe's case, so it's really hard to tell what's going on in Phoebe's personal life that led her to leave her home and live with strangers in a practical dump. Added to this is the whole discussion about Phoebe's mental health at the time of her disappearance. Even though Phoebe's aunt, Cass Johnson, questioned Phoebe's mental state and her work in the NDIS, Phoebe's mom, Kylie, blatantly denied all sorts of claims about her daughter's mental health and accused her own estranged sister of creating a circus by making comments without proof or evidence. She went into this massive tangent about how her sister was basically just being a pot stirrer and drumming up drama that was never really there. I personally can't really make heads or tails of this, but it seems painfully obvious that Phoebe's home life was most likely not pleasant. And this bit alone puts into perspective maybe why she wanted to move out and start on her own, albeit with some very strange roommates, but maybe that's all she could afford. In the end, all that matters is that Phoebe gets justice, and that's what everyone wants, whether they know Phoebe personally or not. Well, on June 30th, 2025, Phoebe's funeral was held, and she was laid to rest in Bundaberg. It was a private funeral, and friends and family gathered to say their final goodbyes. It was a very dark day for Phoebe's loved ones, but regardless, they wore brightly colored clothes to the assembly because they believed that's what Phoebe would have wanted. She loved everything vibrant and bright, and she really just wanted to be happy. She was cheerful, she loved to sing, dance, and hug people, and her loved ones wanted to remember her in that same way. I really hope that Phoebe's case reaches a conclusion soon. Hopefully as soon as next month based on the time of recording this video. We'll just have to see how things end up working out, but the next court hearing is supposed to take place in August. If there are any major updates, I'll do my best to touch base here and post them down in the comments, but I just hope that answers come out, the perpetrators get punished, and this grieving family can finally get some closure as to why and how their daughter's life was ripped away from her. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of True Crime Stories. If you're new here and you liked the video, be sure to hit that like button and consider subscribing. It's completely free and just lets you know when I post new videos. If you love the show and want to help support us, consider hitting that join button below the video and become a member of the channel. It just lets you see new videos sometimes days or weeks before they're posted to the public, and it is a great way to help support the show. And speaking of which, I wanted to give a shout out to some new channel members this week, including Lexi Dorhout, Christina R., Christy Weidman, Colleen, and Joshua Froman. But if you still haven't had your fill and want to see more true crime stories, check out this other interesting case I covered. And don't forget, you can grab True Crime Stories t-shirts by clicking the link below the video, including our most recent It's Never a Mannequin design. But with that, my name is Ty Knotts. I thank you guys again for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next video.